Having talked about uh, Seurat and Cezanne in the last couple lectures, artists who sought to impose a formal order on the ephemera of everyday experience, I want to talk now about Van Gogh, an artist who took Impressionism in a very different direction. Like Seurat, Van Gogh lived a relatively short life, 37 years in Van Gogh's case, from 1853 to 1890. And he was an artist only the last 10 years of his life, from about age 27 to 37. Um, to review Van Gogh's life, his biography to begin with, um, he was the son of a minister, and his family, his various relatives, tended to be in two different professions: the ministry on the one hand, and they were art gallery dealers on the other. The connection with the dealing of art led Van Gogh to take up an apprenticeship as a art gallery dealer in training from his mid-teen years, from about age 15 or 16, and he continued in this role for about 6 years. He was stationed in The Hague. He was stationed in London for a time, and in Paris. So he became rather worldly at a young age, and was surrounded by art. However, his interests became increasingly, they shifted to religion toward the end of that period of time. And after about 6 years with the firm of Goupil, Van Gogh was let go. Um, his skills as a salesman were it seems not good. And he may have been somewhat hard to get along with. He was argumentative, he was opinionated throughout his life. He then sought to follow in his father's footsteps and become a minister. But this required that he gain the necessary background in Latin and Greek, as well as mathematics, that he had not acquired in his own school training. And so he embarked on a year of study in Amsterdam in order to then enter theology school, but gave up after about a year. And this is somewhat perplexing because at this time he would have been 23 years of age. He could speak 4 different languages. He was linguistically gifted, but it seems he was frustrated by the patience required to plod along and deal with these languages. He really wanted to preach the gospel and to minister to people. He spent a few years in a bookshop as an employee there, and then his family helped him find a position as an evangelical minister to coal miners in the Borinage region of southern Belgium. His position was provisional. The mission authorities thought him a poor preacher, but gave him a chance. When they visited him in the field about 6 months later, they found him looking slovenly. He'd given his clothes away to the miners that he thought needed them more than he did, and they fired him from the ministerial position. So by this time, he's about 27 years of age. He's failed at a number of things, and he decided to become an artist, declaring that he was homesick for the land of pictures. He went through his meager funds rather quickly, but his brother came to his rescue. His brother had followed him into the business of dealing art, and his brother began sending him monthly checks, enough to get by on, not a great deal of money, but a sufficient amount to get by on. And he did this for the remaining 10 years of Van Gogh's life. Van Gogh sold a painting or two. He he sold one painting that we know of. He certainly traded for others and began to build up a collection in that way. He sold a few prints, but he sold virtually nothing, and so was utterly dependent on his brother's help. Let's look at some images. All right, in embarking on an effort to become an artist, um, Van Gogh uh, did a lot of copying of the works that he admired, and I would say that primary among the painters that he admired when he began was Millet. Millet's images of peasants appealed to him greatly. They seemed genuine and they seemed to have a kind of spiritual quality. Um, and so we're looking here at Van Gogh's copy of Millet's painting of the sower. And this would be one of the most important images for Van Gogh, a pose that he incorporated into his own art and used many times. He made literally hundreds of drawings of the human figure. Um, During this period of self training, he he lived with his parents a couple different times in Etten and Nuenen. He spent a few years in The Hague. Altogether, he was about 5 years in the Netherlands before going to Paris and then to the south of France. So we can really divide his career roughly. Uh, it lasted 10 years into three periods. The first of those is 5 years in the Netherlands, a period essentially of self-instruction, of self-training, a period of 2 years in Paris, during which time he was exposed to all of the current trends, the current developments in the practice of art. There was a lot to see on exhibition. He met avant-garde artists. He absorbed many different ideas and techniques, and then assimilated them into his own style, his own manner, which he put to use in painting prolifically while living in the south of France during the last couple of years of his life. 1 year in Arles, and then 1 year roughly in an insane asylum where he went voluntarily. And that's it. That pretty well sums up his career. So early on in the Netherlands, here, for example, is one of his many figural drawings. They tend to be somewhat stiff. If he's depicting movement, peasants digging, peasants sowing seed, they look rather stiff. They look as if posed rather than truly active and moving at their tasks. And yet they show growing facility little by little. Here a painting of a girl wearing a shawl. He invited a sometime prostitute laundress to live with them to share his meager accommodations. And she had with her um, a daughter and became pregnant as well. And so we often see them as the models that pose for him. Here, the little girl. We're looking here at a lithograph that's based on a drawing, and you'll notice that the title "Sorrow" certainly expressed intensely in the pose, in the attitude of the figure. But the title is in English. Um, Having lived in London, he was aware of the market for printed art. Goupil dealt extensively in prints. And so Van Gogh at different times had ideas, uh, marketing ideas as to where he might sell art or a kind of art he might produce for which there was a market. And one of those ideas that he toyed with really for a short period of time was to make lithographs of figures of this kind. Um, the attitude of the figure, one of sorrow, one of despair, is something that we see frequently in his art. And I think this is born in part out of his own um, his own personal struggles and his sympathy for those who worked hard and struggled to survive. Here another drawing of that kind called At Eternity's Gate, again with an English title written there at the bottom. While living in The Hague in roughly 1882, Van Gogh received a commission. And the commission came from an uncle of his named Cornelius, who had a gallery in Amsterdam. And the commission was to provide about 10 drawings of scenes in The Hague. And this is one of the drawings that Van Gogh produced. Now, the subjects that he chose were not what one might expect. They were not the grand buildings, the fancy places in the city, but rather the modest places along the periphery. This is the entrance to a pawnbroker's shop. The gate there apparently leads into the shop, and we have figures milling around outside, figures that look meagerly dressed, and people of the kind that might bring something to sell at the pawnbroker shop. But you'll notice here that the sense of space, the rendering of a deep perspectival space is quite competently done. The drawing's a bit fussy, perhaps, but it is a persuasive illustration of this place, done in pencil with white used to heighten a few accents here and there. And another drawing in the same group is this one, entitled Gas Tanks at The Hague. So here is an industrial subject, something that may have been regarded as novel and future-oriented. There is, I see, a windmill here in the distance. And this would have this scene would have been on the periphery of the city. Here we see another charcoal drawing of a tree, a subject that Van Gogh was attracted to throughout his life. And he tended to anthropomorphize trees, to see in them or to imbue them with human qualities of mobility or struggle. And certainly the age of this tree and its twisted limbs suggests struggle, endurance, fortitude. While in The Hague, Van Gogh was introduced to the materials of painting and his first efforts in painting by an uncle whose name was Mova, Anton Mova. Mova was a successful painter and a member of what was called the Gray School in Dutch art at the time. This is a work in watercolor, and it is of women, the wives of miners carrying loads of coal on their back. So here again is an image of human struggle, of human effort, of toil, the toil enacted by those who have to struggle to survive. Van Gogh from The Hague went to Drenthe, an area in the very north of the Netherlands, only for about 3 months' time, however. He expected to meet other landscape painters there. He met, I think, few if any artists. The weather was miserable, his money was short, and so after being there only about 3 months, he returned to his parents' home, then in Nuenen, in the south of the Netherlands, and was there for a couple years' time. While in Nuenen, he concentrated his efforts on painting, and his major effort was the production of a large work called The Potato Eaters. He went about making that work in a rather traditional manner, that is, doing individual figure studies, portraits of heads, building up a composition through a number of studies, and then finally carrying out the full-scale final composition, which is about 3 feet by 4 feet in size, in April and May of 1895. This is one of the portrait studies, he said. He said in his letters that if he did 50 of these, that he felt like he would have some confidence in rendering the human head in paint in a convincing way. And this is the final result, the potato eaters. Um, what we see here is a family having a meager meal, an evening meal, which consists of nothing more than potatoes that have been perhaps baked. They're steaming on a plate there in the center and being stabbed with forks and knives to be consumed. And the woman on the right hand side is pouring coffee. Um, the the portrait I just showed you can see right here is very similar to this woman. But in general, the faces seem exaggerated in their coarseness, in their ugliness. There's an element of caricature here. Um, the, um, the, the, the coloring is gray, green, dark throughout. Um, the dark scene lit only by the lamp in the center. Um, you'll be reading you'll be reading a particular letter where Van Gogh talks about his aims here. But again, we have the subject of people struggling for their existence, uh, people that Van Gogh, whose plight in life Van Gogh sympathized with, and he regarded what they do as honest work. They earned their living, and they seem to be grateful for what they had. The work was sent to Theo in Paris. Van Gogh had high hopes that this would be shown around, it would be appreciated, and it would gain him a foothold in the art world. The ugliness of it, I think, made Theo, his brother, very hesitant to show it. It would have seemed just unbearably homely and even badly painted, given the conventional standards for art at the time. So, oh yeah, I do have one more painting from Van Gogh's early period. This is entitled Still Life with Bible and Novel, and it's a work that is symbolic and autobiographical in some important ways. Van Gogh's father had died in, I think the year was 1885, while Vincent was in Noonan. Um, they were frequently arguing. Um, the father threatened Van Gogh with committing him to an insane asylum a few times. So there were heated arguments between the two, and the father, being a minister, is here symbolized by the big, heavy, open book, the Bible. It is a Bible, and the words Isaiah appear here at the top of the right-hand page. Um, utilizing a conventional symbol in Dutch art of the 17th century, there is a candle here that has burned out. It looks like there's a little bit of smoke coming from it. This is the hasp that holds the book shut. But what we have here, perched on the edge of the table, a novel. It is Joie de Vivre by Émile Zola, part of the Rougon-Macquart series that Van Gogh was reading at the time. Van Gogh commented in his letters that his father objected to his reading of these novels, thought that they were somewhat salacious. That there was little of the truth of life that one could get from the novels. Van Gogh disagreed vehemently, and so this is just one of the things they argued about. So the novel clearly here symbolizes Van Gogh. It looks rather small and precarious and overwhelmed in size by the Bible, the weighty Bible behind it. So it suggests their fraught relationship. And we have the candle indicating the recent death of his father. The, the, the novel there, in its smallness, in its it's dog-eared, by the way. You can see the corners here. it um, it's small size relative to everything else in the painting would seem to suggest um, the obstacles of convention and um, well, the convention, the established order that Van Gogh saw himself struggling against, that his father very much represented. All right, so having been in the Netherlands and uh, pursuing a program of self-education, self-training for about 5 years, Van Gogh moved to Paris, where his brother was located. He did spend about 3 months uh, in um, in Antwerp, working at the Academy of Art there. 3 months of training before moving to Paris. And when he got to Paris, one of the reasons for coming was to study in the studio of Cormon, Cormon. Cormon was an artist well-established exhibitor at the Salon who attracted a large number of students. There may have been 20, 30 students working in the studio. Um, and Theo had said to Vincent that he thought that, that, um, that Vincent might gain some important lessons there, and Cormon would be open to taking him. Um, and so there he landed. He met other artists, Emile Bernard, Toulouse-Lautrec, who were working in Cormon's studio. Louis Anquetin was another. However, Cormon closed the studio down only about 2 or 3 months later. So the training there did not last long. Nonetheless, we can see in Van Gogh's early efforts in Paris um, the pursuit of a more academic approach. For example, the drawing of plaster casts, and that's what's illustrated here in his drawing of Myron's statue of the Discobolus that's sort of been available in a plaster cast. And the drawing is really quite competent. Um, you notice an outline which is somewhat roughly done, but does describe suggestively, uh, quite emphatically the, 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 the anatomical structure of the figure's body, the muscle masses that make it up, and the modeling I think, is effectively done as well. He did paintings of plaster casts, and so here we see a female torso. This is an object I think he owned. There are quite a number of drawings and paintings of it from all different angles. Here we see one and yet another. And you can see here that his colors have lightened from the browns and blacks and grays that really dominate his Dutch work. The colors have lightened considerably. Another project that he undertook was to try to fully comprehend and um, to absorb from experience the ideas on color that were expressed by Charles Blanc in his textbook on the art of design. And Blanc's discussion of color identifies complementary colors and analogous colors and broken colors. Broken colors being, let's say, a red that is altered by having another color combined with it. And so here we see Van Gogh in one of many floral still lifes. He could go to the flower market and he could select flowers of the colors that he wanted to work with, and have uh, bright, a bright, attractive, engaging subject to work on for a few days' time before the flower is wilted. So we see him working here with complementary colors. That is primarily greens and reds. And the red is quite pure in this gladioli. The red is modified by white, so it's a pink color in other gladioli. And these pinks and reds are set against green branches or green leaves. We can see both colors mixed together. So the mixing of complementaries green and red produces a neutral gray. And we can see that seems to be the result here. That just seems to be the way the tabletop was colored, mixing those complementaries together with the ingredient colors then standing out in the flowers that lie on top, a contrasting blue background. Van Gogh did many of these. He would have regarded these not as something to exhibit or to sell, but they're studies. Here is an image of fritillaries. You can see the title in a copper vase. And we're looking here at a complementary relationship of blue and orange. Um, we also see that the technique that Van Gogh called stippling, that is the background made up of little dots. Now, by this time, when Van Gogh came to Paris in 1886, he would have seen he did see, we know, the last Impressionist exhibition. And you recall that the big painting on view there was Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on La Grande Jatte, with its methodically pointillist surface. So that was a technique he was exposed to, and we see him trying that out. And he tried that out in other works as well. Here, a work called Vase with Autumn Asters, with a narrower range of colors and more lights and darks. Another example, Flower Pot and Chives. Again, greens and reds, not particularly bright in this instance. And finally, a vase with red and white carnations on a yellow background. This is really quite a beautiful little painting. I did not know this until gathering images together to give this lecture. It's almost Manet-like in its deft brushwork. The carnations, brilliant reds, loosely drawn, loosely painted blooms against a complementary green, dark green mug or jug, and then irregularly projecting out to the side the contrasting carnations in white color with their stems and leaves quite attractively silhouetted against the yellowish background, yet broadly painted, very painterly in execution there. Another influence at this time, we can regard these years of Paris at a time when Van Gogh, as I remarked earlier, was exposed to a wide range of styles and artists, visual experiences, and is trying everything out. He absorbed these things like a sponge. He was not partisan. He was really too new to all this to become partisan and to cast his lot with one style over another. He's trying everything. Well, one of the things that he began collecting when he stopped in for a few months in Antwerp on his way to Paris was Japanese prints. And he then collected these quite enthusiastically while in Paris, ultimately owning 200 or 300 prints. These are on view today in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. This is a lovely print here, I think, by Hiroshige, entitled The Plum Orchard at Kamedo. And, for Van Gogh as well as other artists at the time, what they saw in these Japanese prints was a whole different way, a whole new way of depicting the world, spatially, in the use of color, in the portrayal of particular objects. So here, for example, we're looking right through a plum tree in the foreground, which is just a fragment of the whole tree. And notice that it's truncated at the bottom. We don't see the trunk. We don't see where it meets the ground. We don't see the edges of it on either side, nor do we see the top of it. But these different, the trunk and these limbs form a very interesting foreground pattern through which we see other plum trees in the distance. There is little modeling of the tree. It's essentially a ungradated dark gray shape from side to side. Likewise, the ground is a green field. The sky does vary from light to dark. Uh, Van Gogh made a copy of this. This is one way of absorbing the lessons that a different kind of art presents, that is to copy it. But he copied it not in printed form, but in painted form, and this is the result. Uh, let me see. Let me go back here and put the two up together, so you can see how close they are. Um, Van Gogh's brushstrokes are visible in places, but he's tried out in the ground, for example, the effect of a flat, unmodulated surface. And notice the trees in the distance are outlined and then filled in with a solid color. This is a new way of painting for him. Now, it's said that the border that he's given the work, which you can see on left and right, made up of Japanese characters, is an advertisement for a brothel. Uh, Now, he would not have understood, gifted as he was with language, he would not have understood these characters and what they say. He must have just simply copied them from some other source, and in the end, we had this humorous result of a brothel advertisement coupled with blossoming plum trees, a rather incongruous pairing. Another example of a Japanese print. Notice the flat uh, background without detail. The face, which is altogether white, with just a few details provided, no modeling whatsoever, and likewise an absence of modeling in the garment, but interesting and varied patterns. Here is a work by Van Gogh where he's made a painted copy of a print of a Japanese woman wearing a kimono. Notice that she too appears against um, an unmodulated colored background. She appears as a flat, rather two-dimensional kind of cutout form herself, with little modeling, but a wealth of patterns in her kimono. And Van Gogh has given this a border of a of the lily pads and looks like bamboo on the right hand side in a marsh location. All right, so this is one kind of art that he learned from, that he looked upon with great interest and drew lessons from. And then something else was Impressionism. So as you're going to read in a letter, he had no idea what Impressionism looked like before coming to Paris. He'd heard the word, but it just didn't make any sense to him. He would have been exposed to Impressionist art in a number of ways, from attending that last exhibition, but also because his brother, as an art gallery dealer, the Goupil firm that he worked for had been purchased by Busson and Valadon, and Theo was given the responsibility to exhibit and sell new art, meaning the art of the Impressionists and their contemporaries. Uh, Theo organized shows of paintings by Monet and Degas. So these are things that Van Gogh would have seen, would have heard Theo talk about, and we see his own attempt at Impressionism emerging in works like this, which have contemporary subjects, scenes around Paris, particularly in the periphery of Paris, painted in bright colors and in the broken, painterly manner of Monet, Renoir, Sisley, and others. Here, a bridge over the Seine River at Asnières, and the banks of the Seine, Paris, here, painted in 1887. Back to the influence of Seurat. So the pointillist technique and the division of the color into component hues of neo-impressionism is something that Van Gogh tried. And so we're looking here at the interior of a restaurant um, at Clichy. And we can see probably painted before the restaurant opened, um, a pointillist technique used throughout. The colors of this work and the Impressionist works we saw earlier, much lighter than anything Van Gogh had used before. And ultimately, he would not have the temperament for this technique. Um, and yet he would use it occasionally. He would use it where it served his needs. And here a painting of entitled Portrait of an Italian Woman, or Italian Woman. Her name was Agostino Segatori, and she ran a restaurant called Le Tambourin, the Tambourine. Now, one of the things that Van Gogh did while in Paris was to organize a couple exhibitions of young, emerging, struggling artists like himself, the artists that he had met in the Cormont studio. Emile Bernard was one, Anquetin was another. And one of those exhibitions took place at the Tambourin restaurant. I mean, these were not prestigious exhibitions. They attracted very little notice, little criticism, um, and yet it is an interesting and perhaps significant effort of his while in Paris. It's said he had a relationship, an affair with this woman, by some commentators, maybe not. His painting of her is very interesting, and notice that he's utilized here some of these techniques that he learned from Japanese prints, with the background of solid color. Really, everything is flattened out, even the figure and her position. It's not clear whether she's standing or sitting. Well, sitting, I suppose, more certainly, because we see a chair back here. But her lower body, is this a tabletop? It would seem to be. Her hands rest on a couple of flowers in her hands. Um, the chair back in blue is offset by the frame in red and green, which appears only on two sides of the painting. So there's something of an irregular, but nonetheless, I think satisfying a balanced framing of the figure in the middle. And you can see that she's not painted here in local colors, but rather in a kind of divisionist technique where her face is made up of all kinds of, of, of hues, blues and greens, as well as more flesh tones, pinkish tones. And the result is an image of really considerable force and strength and visual interest that adds a kind of visual excitement that runs a bit counter to her rather static pose. And here a portrait of the color merchant Père Tanguy. Tanguy ran an art supply shop. A lot of artists bought materials and particularly colors from him. His shop was also a meeting place where artists hung out and discussed their work, and perhaps a few things were put on exhibit. It's said that Van Gogh met Gauguin in the shop of Tanguy. Van Gogh did two versions of this portrait. In one, he humorously places a print of Mount Fujiyama right behind Tanguy's hat so that one seems to merge with the other. This version includes, again, Japanese prints in the background, but it also includes here a work by Van Gogh, a work that I'm going to show you next. And I think it would seem that the inclusion of the work here would suggest that Van Gogh was particularly proud of, felt a sense of accomplishment with this work. So his interest in portraiture continues, and we see, with the presence of the Japanese prints, the ongoing impact of that art, that style on his painting. Now here is that still life painting. This is one of the last things he painted before leaving Paris to spend a couple years in the south of France. The title, well, it's labeled here just still life, but it should be like still life with pears, grapes, apples, something like that. It's simply an enumeration of the fruit that is present. But you'll notice that we've strayed a long way from naturalism. The work is really quite abstract. the presumed fabric on which the fruit sits, something like a tablecloth, looks topographical, looks like a landscape with hills that rise and fall. The painting is largely monochromatic in a range of yellows, with the exception of the fruit, where we see, well, lots of yellows, but uh, shadows and outlines drawn in red and bits of green as well. So analogous colors dominate, but there are complementaries introduced as well. And notice he's given the painting a frame, a painted frame. And apparently the painted frame was originally a little different, that this inner edge was painted red. And I say that from looking at here, uh, the fragment of it included in the portrait of Tanguy, where you can see the inner edge is red. Okay, so in leaving Paris, Van Gogh um, has learned a number of things and tried a number of things from the study of Japanese prints. His art has gone from dark colors to very bright colors. Um, he has tried a wide range of subjects. He's had a kind of flirtation with Impressionism, and certainly is working here with broken brushwork, um, and yet in many cases more intense colors than naturalistic ones. So we might label him already a post-impressionist. Uh, so he went to the south of France and he got off the train in Arles. Why he did that is something of a mystery. And there he would stay for about a year's time. When he got off the train, this was late February, he was surprised to find that the southern French landscape was covered with snow. Now that snow disappeared rather quickly. And soon almond trees and fruit trees blossomed. And this is one of the first subjects that he took up. And so here we see one of the first works he painted in Arles. Bright colors, notice the outline of the trees, much like his copy of the Japanese print. He was to label this work Souvenir de Mauve, that is a remembrance of Mauve. You recall that Mauve was his uncle and introduced him to painting, but I didn't say that Mauve kind of washed his hands with Van Gogh when he realized that he was living with a prostitute in The Hague. So their relationship was a difficult one. And nonetheless, Van Gogh was moved to hear that Mauve had died, and so signed the work and inscribed the work with this tribute to Mauve, remembrance of Mauve. Originally, he signed it to Theo, his brother, and Vincent, but Theo said, "Well, it's from you. You should not include my name." So we're looking at Van Gogh's mature style here, and I'm sure you recognize it as such. You would recognize this by Van Gogh probably immediately. This is the Langlois drawbridge in the countryside around Arles. The bridge still exists, although it's been moved to a different location. The bridge was made famous by Van Gogh's paintings of it, and so it has been saved in recent years, though moved, as I said, to a different location. But you'll notice that this is a study, largely, in the complementary colors of orange and blue. And they appear in most parts of the painting. The water, the sky, the water blue with orange reflections, the bridge, a mixture of orange and blue masonry, the sky blue, of course, but with this orange drawbridge rising up into it, and likewise the poplar trees, orange in color. Van Gogh was fully aware and really knew from his personal painting experience by this time that the juxtaposition of complementaries, putting them side by side, causes them to intensify one another. The orange makes the blue look more brilliantly blue, and likewise the blue makes the oranges look more brilliantly orange. A carriage crosses the drawbridge at this instant, and we're looking at women washing clothing along the edge of the water here in the foreground. This was a painting effort in Arles that Van Gogh felt especially proud of. It is more carefully painted, more tightly organized than most of his works. Uh, so what we're seeing is the harvest going on. These are the farm fields. The region is called La Crau, Crau, that stretches from Arles out toward the mountains of the Alpilles, the Little Alps. And we can see here a monastery called Montmajour, which is about 5 miles from Arles. Van Gogh would walk these fields frequently. He would make drawings of and paintings of the fields from Montmajour back toward Arles, in this case, looking toward Montmajour. So we see a blue cart here in the center, human activity in different places in the distance, neatly circumscribed farm fields, orange roofs with blue shadows, you'll notice. And notice that the brushwork is um, pretty much equally painterly from front to back of the painting. So where we would expect to find greater precision in the foreground, because we're seeing that more closely, we do not. We see the rather his very loose, sketchy, painterly portrayal of the wheat or the grasses in the foreground. In making scenes like this, Van Gogh made use of an artist's tool called a perspective frame. And this was essentially a wooden framework about the size of a painting, 2 feet by 3 feet, open in the center except for strings which were stretched across it. And what the painter would do was set this up. It had legs that could be adjusted, so it could be raised to different heights or adjusted to the slope of the hill. The legs had spiky, pointed bottoms, so it could be pushed right into the ground. So you could set this up to frame a scene in the distance, and then you look through it and use those guidelines of the strings in order to transfer what appeared between them onto your canvas. One might divide up your canvas or the canvas in front of you in a similar way, just as you would grid a sketch in order to transfer it to a canvas or somewhere larger. Well, here's a work that you all know from his Arles period, The Night Cafe, a work that he labeled as one of the ugliest he had made, but we regard it today as one of his most powerfully expressive. He characterized this as a place where one could go mad, ruin oneself, commit a crime. He tried to express the powers of darkness by means of red and green. So given those statements, it's a place that he had rather negative feelings about. He said that he stayed up for 3 nights in order to paint this. He was at the time renting space above the Night Cafe from the landlord that you see right here. And to get his revenge on the exorbitant amount he had to pay, he painted this scene and included the landlord within it. Rachel, notice that the painting contains a number of gray hues. We've got the olive gray of the table. We've got a light kind of sea green. I mean green. I should have said green, not gray. Olive green of the tablecloth. A sea green of the bar back here. The marble tabletops have a greenish hue. The ceiling is a medium, strong, quite brilliant green. And these greens appear in many cases against or alongside or adjacent to the brilliant red walls. Notice that the proprietor has green hair against the red background. The gas lamps emanate light rendered in strokes of kind of green and yellow. The bar, the ceiling appear against the red walls. So those colors, of course, intensify one another and make them more emphatic, more strong and forceful than they would be otherwise. The space here seems a bit awry. The floor rises very steeply, so steeply that it would seem that the table might slide off of it, and it recedes to the small back wall and door rather precipitously. It seems a bit exaggerated in perspective recession. And the brush strokes, particularly on the floor, are very roughly done. So these are all of the formal devices he's using at the time, not only color, but also brushwork and texture to convey, in this case, a place where he says one might go mad, commit a crime. Another famous painting from Arles, well-known painting of the Cafe Terrace at night, where he shows us the Cafe Terrace as a inviting, warmly lit uh, uh, locale in the darkness of Arles. Now, Arles, like most small towns of France at the time, would not have had night lighting, no gas lighting. So when it got dark, the streets were very dark, and it would have been, in some places, a bit dangerous to be out. Um, so, um, given those circumstances, a place like this would be inviting, would be what one would be drawn to. Um, this is then the first of three uh, paintings that he would make of the night sky, the stars in the night sky, leading ultimately to the Starry Night. Another project that he took up was the painting of sunflowers, again, among his most famous works. This was an extended project. He did not do just one painting of sunflowers, but a whole series of them. Now, by this time, he had a house to rent in Arles. It was painted yellow on the outside, and he was engaged in correspondence with Gauguin. He invited Gauguin, who was then in Brittany, but struggling and impoverished. He had invited him to come to Arles and to reside there, and they would share the yellow house. The the plan was that they would share expenses and could thereby live more cheaply, and would encourage each other in their painting efforts, presumably learn from each other. Uh, and so, in preparation for Gauguin's coming, Van Gogh painted these sunflower images to decorate the yellow house. Um, and I'll show you here three of them, and you'll see him using different color combinations. Here, a painting primarily in analogous colors, golds, yellows, and browns. The sunflowers rendered, particularly their leaves, as spiky forms. Um, the sunflowers themselves, like solar circles against the light wall behind. Notice the influence of Japanese prints in his portrayal of the background. By the way, these brushstrokes that run in a couple different directions, that's called um, a crépon effect. And Van Gogh does this a number of times. And it's something he observed in Japanese prints, not in the print so much as the paper that it was made on. Uh, and you'll notice then that the division between the table, the background, and the base, those divisions uh, are delineated in contour lines, much the way you might see figures, objects outlined in a Japanese print. Here, another image in that series. In this case, complementary colors, oranges against a blue background. The brushwork here, a little more painterly, a little more heavily textured. We would call this impasto, where the paint is built up in a paste-like textured mass. And here, a third version. Some of these, and this may be one example, it seems to me, the colors have faded considerably. Van Gogh did not use the highest quality paints. These came in large part from Tanguy. And some of these paints were unstable, chemically unstable, and so their colors have faded, right? Quite, in some cases, quite extensively over time. While in Arles, Van Gogh in, in, embarked on a series of portraits, and he regarded these as symbolic portraits. Um, that is, the people that he painted were to represent a class of people or a particular profession. Um, this idea probably came from Thomas Carlyle, whose book, I forget the name of the book, but he, for example, refers to artists as artist types. These could be writers, they could be musicians, um, could be painters as poets, and Van Gogh would paint a poet. Well, this is a painting entitled "The Old Peasant." Van Gogh does identify this man by name um, once or twice, but he really regarded him as a kind of man of the hoe, a farmer of the crow, who is burnt dark by the heat of the sun uh, from the experience of harvest. So he's a human type. Uh, he represents agricultural workers in a general sense in this region of the world. Uh, this too is a study in complementary colors, with the blue smock of a worker set against the orange colors of background, hat, face, and hands. You notice the hands and the face are burnt a dark orange by the sun. And we see blue in the beard, in the hair, in the eyes, and in lots of details within the face. So again, it's complementary, it's played against each other throughout much of the painting. All right, and here we have this painting of the poet. We know the man's name is Eugène Bach. He was a painter himself, but the painting is called The Poet. Van Gogh renders him in his physical features really quite precisely. This compares favorably with photographs that survive of this man. But you'll see the background is the starry sky, and this was intended symbolically. Because this man dreams great dreams, because he sings as the nightingale sings, Van Gogh says he wanted to paint infinity behind him. And infinity he symbolizes in the starry sky. Painted very simply as a dark blue field, complementary to the orange garment, the oranges in the face, with a few dots, one most obviously indicating a star. Correspondence with Gauguin went on for a long time, month after month, with Gauguin reporting on what he was doing and promising to come and then not come, Van Gogh expecting him and then giving up for a time. Well, meanwhile, Gauguin in Normandy was painting in Brittany was painting this, The Vision After the Sermon. And you'll notice that it shares some features of style in common with Van Gogh's work in Arles. The use of bright colors, the flat areas of color, particularly in the ground here. Gauguin was using conventional elements of style like modeling selectively, subjectively, so that he would model some things and not other things. But he's interested here in inner experience, and hence deviated a great distance from the naturalism of Impressionism, the optical experience of Impressionism, in order to try to capture something of the mysterious states within these women, a prayer, their prayerful attitudes, and the vision that they see of Jacob wrestling with the archangel in the distance. So it was in October that Gauguin did arrive in Arles. He remained for 9 weeks before leaving, around Christmas in 1888. And the artists worked quite intensely together. So here's a comparison of works they made. We're looking at one of the locations that they visited, and this is called Les Halles Camp, which is the Provençal or Languedoc dialect for Champs-Élysées, Elysian Fields. This was the burial ground of medieval origin, located on the outskirts of Arles. In Van Gogh's painting on the left-hand side, we can see sarcophagi. If you go there today, some of these sarcophagi, the ones in the poorest condition, without decoration, a lot of them still stand there. All the good ones have been taken into a museum. Probably many, many more were outside in the late 19th century. And this was a place where people went to stroll, as we can see happening here. So this is a canal in the Gauguin painting, and a bank along the canal. And over here on this side would be Les Halles Camp, the cemetery. the sarcophagus lined abdomen. So uh, the artists would set up their easels close to one another, um, um, looking in different directions, perhaps. Their interests were trained on slightly different subjects, um, and might work together for a day's time. Well, notice that the painting by Van Gogh adopts a more Japanese approach in looking steeply down at the ground from the top of the bank. The trees that mark off a kind of rhythmic sequence are outlined in a solid color and filled in um, with uh, with blue. Blue probably chosen because it was the complementary to the orange that you see beyond. The figures, this one most obviously outlined, drawn rather simply. Um, Gauguin, in contrast, has shown us a deeper space in a bit more conventional way, although the space seems to rise up vertically as much as it goes back into the distance. The foreground is really no more detailed than the background is. This is the church of Saint Honorat at the end of Les Années Camp. The brushwork is very, very different. Now, in Van Gogh's case, we don't really see brushstrokes here, but more just simply filling in of a shape with a solid color. You'll notice that Gauguin's brushwork is more careful, lots of areas of linear strokes. It's quite thinly painted. Um, this was the autumn, and so presumably the orange here is that of leaves having fallen on the ground. Gauguin shows the poplar trees with brilliant orange leaves. The artists argued a great deal about style. They argued about all kinds of things, but Gauguin thought Van Gogh was a messy painter. Um, he thought he relied too heavily on complementary contrasts. He encouraged him to paint from his imagination rather than relying on a model. And this was something that Van Gogh did try. And here I show you one of the examples of that. This is called the, what is it called? Yeah, the red vineyard. He did a green vineyard as well. This is the red vineyard. And so we see a vineyard at the time of harvest. There are people working in the fields. But there's also, rather oddly, a woman here strolling with a parasol. And it seems that this painting was made in the studio, may have been based somewhat on sketches made out of doors. The sun, of course, is exaggerated, as Van Gogh would do quite often, to a large orb exuding heat. And a variety of techniques used here. The quasi-Japanese technique is simply outlining a figure in dark lines and filling in. You see that. You see the impressionist brushwork, though the colors are more subjective ones, and place the complementaries of orange and blue against one another in many parts of the painting. Motifs that were observed at different places, I think, for example, the woman with the umbrella, have been inserted here in order to populate the scene in an interesting way. This is the one painting that Van Gogh sold. When it was exhibited in Paris at the time of the Salon of the Independence in 1889, it was purchased by the sister of Eugène Bach, who modeled for the poet. She was an artist as well, from Belgium. Here another painting that was done from memory. And what he's done here is to bring together a number of motifs that were favorites of his. Well, one would be the tree that looks Japanese-like in the way it's truncated, fragmented at top and bottom. It crosses the picture plane, divides it into a couple spaces in an irregular way. The figure of the sower ultimately goes back to the art of Millet. So he's inserted that. And notice he's given the sower kind of a halo in the and large sun that we just saw in the previous painting. So three different motifs brought together and laid against the arbitrarily colored fields that lead into the distance. Van Gogh continued to paint portraits, and toward the end of his stay in Arles, he had the opportunity to paint all the members of the postmaster's family. Now, this man, Joseph Roulin, the postman, I should say, he had befriended Van Gogh. He might have seen him daily in delivering mail. And so they had a friendly relationship. Van Gogh describes him as something of a character, as looking like Socrates and having strongly held political ideas, revolutionary at heart. Van Gogh painted him many times, and here's just one example. And then he had the opportunity to paint his whole family, his new child, his other children, and his wife, Josephine Augustine Roulin, who you see here. This is perhaps the most important portrait that Van Gogh made in his entire career. He repeated it 5 times between December of 1888 all the way into about May of 1889. He repeated it because he made copies of it for a few people, one to leave with her, one that he sent to Gauguin. And I think he repeated it also because it was consoling to him. It was an image that brought him a sense of peace and solace at a time when he needed it. Because it was in December of 1888, just like the day before Christmas, when he had his first breakdown. And this seems to have been prompted in part by Gauguin's talk of leaving to return to Paris. Van Gogh's dream of the studio in the South where he might work with other artists, they might encourage each other, was about to fall apart, and this would leave him alone and isolated again. His painting of this portrait for the first time was interrupted by his first breakdown, but he returned to it then when he got his wits back about him. Let's look at this more closely. He referred to this, he actually named this La Berceuse, which means a couple different things. The lullaby, literally, but it was an expression for a woman who rocks a cradle, a nursemaid, who would care for a child. And you can see that she's holding a rope, which is presumably attached to a cradle at her feet. So that rather than bending down to rock the cradle, or maybe kicking it to do the same, she can simply tug gently on the rope and not have to move, but minimally. She is maternal in appearance, a big-breasted, kind of robust-bodied figure whose wide hips suggest childbearing. She had about 5, 6 children. Van Gogh paints her, he said, well, as we can see, in red and green, in various shades of red and green. And the background is something made up. The portrait was initially made in his own studio. Gauguin painted her there as well before leaving. But rather than paint the simple plaster wall of his studio, he has decorated the background with something that looks like wallpaper, floral wallpaper. And we can see a kind of repeated pattern. Notice these 3 floral blooms right here, over here as well. It's all very carefully painted with a repeated pattern that shows patience and discipline of a kind that you don't see often in Van Gogh's work. Well, this is full of greens, which surround her reddish hair, in red lips, in green hues. The floor is a kind of a brick red against the green of her skirt and her top. There's reddish hues here in the chair against the green as well. So and a really abundant play of those two complementary colors. Notice the Japanese technique of outlining the forms, the chair, the skirt in a bold contour, and then filling it in with one color. The floor is treated in the same way. Interestingly, the floor is not aligned from side to side, and it seems that he has run the floor line right up against the chair, where the chair projects outward. This is the kind of decision that Cezanne might make in the interest of formal order. Um, and if we go in more tightly on the face, you can see that there are an abundance of hues in the way that's painted, with green eyes against the gold of the face, the red lips. Um, More painterly brushwork visible in the skirt. He went on painting this image then 5 times, about once a month over the next half a year. And he described this effort in musical terms. He said that he wanted to evoke her singing. He wanted to remind um, the viewer uh, of their memories of being a child themselves, being rocked and sung to. And how did he do this? Well, through color, by getting all of the music in the color. So this is just one of many works where we see what little he knew about music, though he made much of it, influencing his efforts as a painter. Um, Van Gogh was aware that music was an art that was essentially abstract. It represented very little. And yet it could engage the emotions quite powerfully. And so his knowledge of music encouraged him to simplify, to abstract, uh, to do the very things that we see so powerfully done in this work. Okay, so uh, his Van Gogh's first breakdown in Arles was followed by a couple of later breakdowns. He had thought initially that he might just simply get better and be able to return to his yellow house and his painting practice, and he tried to do that. But the later breakdowns made him feel vulnerable, insecure, and fearful that he might have a breakdown while painting in the field. He might be away from assistance and might not recover. So he agreed to enter a nearby asylum voluntarily as a patient. That was at Saint-Remy, located about 15 or 20 miles from Arles. He was not allowed to paint there at all initially, maybe a few weeks or so, a month. And then he was allowed to paint, and then eventually to go outside, but always with a custodian in his company who might watch over him. Um, the asylum was not full of patients, so he was able to use one room as a painting studio apart from the room that he resided in. He just as he had identified certain subjects, particularly sunflowers, as being characteristic of the area around Arles, he identified olive trees and cypresses as characteristic of the area around the asylum. And so he painted both a number of times. And so here we see one of a couple of paintings I'll show you of olive trees. In embarking on this project, he said he wanted to bring more style to these paintings. And so he's resorted to the stippling that he had first seen in the works of Seurat and Signac. But notice the sky is painted that way, although it's combined with longer strokes that represent clouds. The olive trees contain small brush strokes that are close to being just dots of color. And then we see again the longer jabs of color in the ground. The coloring seems quite arbitrary, particularly in the ground, where there are nets spread around the olive trees to gather the olives when they fall and are shaken down in the autumn months. But we also see shadows, the shadows rendered in this lavender color projected by the trees. So there's one example. Here's another example from this series. Notice again that the trees are boldly outlined. It suggests the influence of Japanese prints. And then here's my favorite of the bunch, um, where he's departed from from the stippling and really exaggerated the um, the twisting lines of the olive trees and the shadows on the ground, such that the whole painting just seems to be full of movement. One can see this in the lines that make up the path that runs in between the trees. A painting largely in analogous colors of greens and blues, but with just a few complementary dots of red inserted, particularly in the lower left-hand corner. Here is one of several paintings of cypress trees that he did. Um, he regarded these cypress trees as obeliscal, like an obelisk, and funereal. Well, in fact, they're often planted around graveyards. They're a tree that takes up little space on the ground because they're so vertical, but they rise up into the sky in a way that connects heaven and earth. The name for a cypress tree is Cypressus evervirens, or sempervirens. Sempervirens means always living. Well, they're an evergreen, and so they're a symbol of eternal life as well. Here's a painting that's much like the olive orchard we just saw. It's completely rendered in twisting curvilinear lines, which we see in the tree itself, in the foliage in the foreground, in the line of the alpels and details within it, and in the sky. The crescent moon is a motif that Van Gogh used a great deal, and usually to symbolize a harmonious state. You might see in such a painting a male and female figure walking beneath the harvest moon or crescent moon, and you see this also in the starry night. Now, while in the asylum, Van Gogh was lacking the stimulation of other art, of course, artists to talk to. He found the other patients really much worse off than him. His condition was such that he would have breakdowns, which might render him unable to work and unable to function at all for about as long as a month. And then he would be highly lucid, full of ideas, and very productive. It sounds like a kind of schizophrenia. He regarded the other patients as kind of do-nothings, layabouts, and that's probably because their condition was much worse than him, and they were more continuously depressed or out of their minds. Van Gogh found stimulation instead in images that his brother Theo sent to him in the form of prints. And some of these Van Gogh would request specifically, others Theo would just send on his own volition. Well, he sent a lot of prints of Millet's work. So what you're looking at here is a painting by Millet. It's called Noonday Rest. And what we're looking at is harvesters who are sleeping after a noonday meal. Notice there are haystacks, grain stacks around, horses, and a wagon in the distance, male and female figures in the foreground. Now, what Van Gogh would do is to make copies of these works. And he would not have seen the Millet that we're seeing here on the screen, but rather he would have seen a print of it. The print would reverse the image. That's what, if you simply convert an image to a print, that's what inevitably happens, unless you reverse the print on the plate, and then the image that you strike from the print is just the same as the original. So notice that Van Gogh's image, his version of this, having been made from the print, is reversed from the original painted image by Millet. All right, so what he's doing here is translating Millet's image into his own style. And while the subject matter and the arrangement of forms is virtually the same, the coloring, and I think the overall effect of the work is quite different. So again, there are grain stacks here, a male and female couple sleeping in the foreground. a pair of animals, a wagon. There are also a pair of shoes and a pair of scythes. So we see uh, objects coupled throughout the painting. A pair of scythes, here a pair of figures, a pair of grain stacks, a pair of horses. So, one completes the other. There's a sense of complementarity, of, I think, harmony and unity in the pairing of these objects. You'll notice that the Millet painting, which is largely in earth tones, so we put the two up together, has been converted into the intense, charged colors of Van Gogh's mature style, essentially the primaries of orange and blue. In the foreground, again, orange and blue. The dress, a slightly more purplish color of the woman. The figures boldly outlined, strongly outlined, and but then quite animated brushwork filling in all the shapes. Having trouble moving forward, as always happens, so I'll do it manually. I want to show you a couple other images that seem strongly symbolic from Saint Remy, the asylum at Saint Remy. First, this one. Um, it's called the Reaper, and we see a man harvesting, swinging scythes, one in each hand, as he moves through the field of wheat. And we see this against a purple wall, probably a plastered wall that encloses the field, and the alpilles in the distance, and a large blazing sun and a cloudless sky. It's an image of harvest. Van Gogh said, in writing about this, that it was an image of death as well, because, of course, the wheat is being cut down. But he said it was death that was on the verge of smiling. It's a sun-filled image. The sky contains that big glowing sun, and the landscape is full of light. And he comments, and to think that I painted this through the bars of my cell. And then finally, or almost finally, from Saint Remy is his famous Starry Night. This is an image that goes back to Gauguin's urging that he paint from memory. This is not a scene that he could have seen from one vantage point, but rather it's a kind of synthetic landscape in which motifs from different places have been brought together. There's the line of the alpilles again, much like the previous view. I can't go back there very easily. So we'll just forget about that. Come on. All right, I'm stuck. No images. So let me terminate this video, and I'll come back and finish up the Van Gogh lecture. Not much to go in the second video. Sorry for the confusion.